It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we welcome back to the show a two-time WSOP bracelet winner and the Aussie Millions runner-up. He is also a WPT commentator. He is Tony Dunst. Tony, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Fair play to you. You brought us a hand in which you think you messed up every street. I feel like you could be being a little harsh on yourself, actually. But let's get into it and maybe the audience will decide. It comes from a 2K online event. You are 80 big blinds deep and it folds all the way around to you in the small blinds. This is going to be a blind v blind hand. You look down at the jack of spades, nine of spades, and you elect to limp. Your opponent in the big blind is a very good reg and he makes it 3.5x. You re-raise to 11 bigs and he calls. Right away, I'm thinking Jack 9 suited makes a pretty nice limp call, but possibly versus a tough opponent, like you mentioned he was. You wanted to be harder to predict maybe and felt the need to respond with a mixed strategy of calls and raises?
Yeah, because at deeper stacks, we're mostly going to be starting our small blind play with a limp, especially against other pros who are going to do a bunch of isolating. We want to have a limp re-raise range that includes both some really strong hands and then some like weaker, I guess you'd say bluffing or semi-bluffing hands that have playability post-flop. And so I think that's mostly going to be centered around these suited connectors, suited gappers that have the ability to either flop a top pair that can win at showdown or a draw, as I do, that is pretty playable post-flop.
Well, Dara, I want to bring you in here. I said how I would have erred on the side of a limp call in this spot. Is there another way to go?
Well, I think as Tony said, we are going to be limping most of our range here. So the only other alternative is the limp re-raise. I do think the limp call is the default line here. Obviously, we should have some weak limp re-raises, but I think this hand is almost too strong to be a weak limp re-raise and not strong enough to be a limp re-raise for value. It kind of falls in the middle. So I think if we looked at this in a solver, the way the solvers typically construct their range is they will limp re-raise the really strong hands that they're obviously very happy to get more action from, but they'll also limp re-raise some weaker suited connector type hands as well that have playability if called. But it just feels with Jack 9 suited, certainly if we're limp re-raising all of these types of hands, we're going to be doing far too much with weaker hands.
Well, that's an interesting point there, Tony. Obviously, one of the big buzzwords of the day in strategy terms is frequency. Would you view this as a low frequency? Would you view this as a, like maybe you pick one suit to kind of take these 20%, 25% of the time lines?
Yeah, exactly. In live poker, it's look at the clock. When I'm playing online, I just use the random number generator on a calculator. So I think with the hands such as Jack 9 suited or the suited connectors, suited gappers that I'm going to limp re-raise, they're all going to be, like 10 to 25% of the time in the small blind. And as you said earlier, the default is going to be to limp call.
Well, let's get to the flop. There are 23 big blinds in the middle. It's already reasonably bloated, and it comes the 3 of spades, king of spades, queen of hearts. With the gutter and a flush draw, you see bet 7 bigs, roughly 30%, and your opponent calls. Dara, I'll start with you this time. Without making a pair, this is a very good flop for Tony's particular hand, but it's also a good flop for the range he's representing with the pre-flop limp 3 bet. The stacked about ratio is just 3, which means we could set up a 2 street line of around 70% and then pass. I think you could go 85%, 85% maybe as well. I think that's what I would have done a few years ago. I was a bit preoccupied, I must admit, with the idea of not being able to be blown off my hand back then. I know now that's a bit of a mistake. What I don't know is, does the solver like a check or a small bet as Tony has done here? Can you tell me?
With the overall range, the solver mixes mostly small bets, it has to be said, 65%, which kind of makes sense. As you said, it is a good board for our range. That said, it's not so amazing that it's likely to be a pure range bet, particularly out of position, but we can go ahead and bet a fairly wide range. Interestingly, with this particular hand, the solver, while it does do some low frequency betting, only bets 15% of the time and checks the rest of the time. Again, I feel that's kind of like we have an awkward amount of equity here where we would like to proceed to the turn, but we don't necessarily want to put too much chips in.
Well, makes sense. So, Tony, your play is obviously fine then at a low frequency in Solverland. It's obviously a great result if you fold out some pocket pairs or ace X here, and you can still improve or get your opponent off stronger holdings maybe on a later street as well. Was that roughly your thought process?
My thought process at the time was on these high card boards, the small blind is the aggressor. And this is mostly thinking about it as like if I had raised pre-flop and they called, I haven't studied a ton of limp re-raising spots, and I assumed that the same heuristics would apply. But generally these boards are pretty safe, like dark 30 C-bets, or sometimes you have two sizings where you use a small size and a large size. So when I solved this hand, I was surprised to see that in the output I got, Jack nine of spades was pure checking the flop. The other Jack nine suited combos were going with the bet, and that intuitively makes sense to me. But as you were saying, like we have a very awkward amount of equity here, and it really sucks if we bet and face a raise. And then it's like, well, are we just, I guess, putting it in with like roughly 40%? I mean, we're not really folding. And so I think at the stack to pot ratio, the solvers are concerned with that. And I think if we ran it at a shorter stack to pot ratio, it would probably just like jam the flop. And at a higher one, it would probably always bet. But at this particular level, it's like, hey, you really want to check this hand and bet some hands that either have more, I guess you'd say hot and cold equity, like the really strong ones. And then something like, Jack nine of hearts, Jack nine of clubs makes sense. It's like if we can get those folds, great. If we get raised off our hand, or if we have to give it up on a later street, it's not that big a deal. It's not that much equity going to waste.
Yeah, I like how you describe that there as hot and cold equity. To the turn, the pot is 37 big blinds now, and it comes to four of hearts, putting a second flush draw on the board. The board now reads three of spades, king of spades, queen of hearts, four of hearts. The SPR is now 1.4 to 1. And the action goes check, check. Tony, I'm guessing you were going for maybe the check shove here, although I could be wrong. You could have okay equity if called, and you could obviously, with that line, represent super strong hands. Obviously, there's a danger of betting small and getting jammed on and blown off your equity. Was that your thinking?
I'm pretty sure in game, what I decided to do was just randomize and probably either go with like a larger bet that would mostly commit myself and, ideally fold out ace 10, ace jack that peels the flop. Sometimes I think you can make people fold a queen depending on who they are, how sticky they are, what their impression of you is. Of course, nobody's ever going to fold a king to you. But my guess is that my intention on the turn was to use a random number generator to mix between a large bet and a check. And I think it wanted me again to do like a very high percentage of checking. What did you get for the solver output on this one?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I hate blind and blind spots. I find them incredibly confusing. The solver output I looked at, first of all, in terms of the range, it actually mixed pretty much everything. It checks 35%, tiny bets 15%, small bets 15%, big bets 18%, and shoves 16%. So
pick your poison, really.
Yeah. However, with this specific hand, interestingly enough, it does absolutely nothing else except tiny bet, which is quarter pot or something in or around that, which to my mind kind of made sense. Essentially, it's kind of like a blocker. We obviously love if he folds. It's a great result for us. We don't mind if he calls. We get to the river cheap and can play accordingly. And if he does shove, which in practice I think he should almost never do, but if he does shove, I guess we can fold.
Right. That makes sense.
Well, to the river now, the pot is still 37 big blinds, and it comes the five of hearts, bringing in the backdoor flush. So the final board reads three of spades, king of spades, queen of hearts, four of hearts, five of hearts. You check, Tony, and the big blind shoves, and obviously with just jack high, you fold. Dara, this is a fairly brutal run out for Tony here. Should we just be waving the white flag as he did?
Yeah, I think we should at this point. It's particularly bad run out for us, I think, now, and this is a bad river. So again, the solver output I looked at basically checked 70% of range, and with this exact hand, it just gave up. We have poor blockers, missed flush draws, tend not to make good bluffs, and that's borne out by the hands that it does actually bluff with. It uses stuff like jack 10 off with no spade and suited connectors that are not spades that have even less showdown than our hand. Like we have a bunch of those hands like 10-6 suited, 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited, etc.
Yeah, they all make an awful lot more sense. Tony, I'm keen to give you the final word here. You felt like you messed up this hand, but versus the solver anyway, it's only strongly critical actually of your pre-flop play. You were, of course, not playing a solver though. So was there a population tendency you felt like your hand failed to exploit on other streets?
Most of all, I just felt I misplayed the flop because in the output that I got, it was supposed to be a pure check. And sometimes when I have this stack to pot ratio with a draw that has a moderate but not huge amount of equity, I think I tend to lean towards betting in situations that solver prefers that I check. Also in my output, I actually got a decent amount of block bluffing the river with spades, including this combo. So, maybe we're just putting different parameters into ourselves, and that's why we're getting the differing outputs. But I was like really surprised to see that. And this struck me as a very natural hand to check and give up with, since I blocked so many of the auto folds for my opponent. Personally, I sort of prefer the output you guys got, where I would just rather choose those hands that don't have spades to bluff with and just give up with more of these spade combos that, as I said, just block the auto folds from my opponent. So, I feel pretty indifferent about that one. And as you said, these blind versus blind pots are really tricky because there's so much mixing going on. And there's a lot of just like kind of guessing towards how your opponent is going to react to certain actions. So, I don't think this is like an atrocious hand. Oh my God, what were you thinking? Total brutal misplay. I just remember when I went through from the hands in this session and ran them, this one really stuck out as one where, according to the solver, like I just clicked the wrong button on a bunch of streets.
Mm-hmm. Well, to just dive into that for one more moment, Dara, obviously you've both come up with slightly different outcomes. Maybe starting ranges is what's caused this from the beginning, or of course, not all solvers are equal. When you come across a hand like this, where maybe your student or somebody like that brings a hand to you that they've run and then you run it and there's a slightly different outcome as we see here, what is that normally down to?
Yeah, it usually is the starting ranges. That's usually the case. Like if we have a lot more spade hands, for example, in our range than the solver suggests, then we do probably have to start bluffing some of them on the river. Otherwise, we just don't have enough bluffs. So it usually does come down to starting ranges, and pre-flop starting ranges, they spiral basically because the game tree obviously fans out from pre-flop. So that's the street where the biggest differences in strategy manifest them most strongly by the end of the hand. Whereas, if there's a slight divergence, say on the turn, it's probably not going to make that much difference to the river.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, look, it has been a fascinating hand to put under the microscope. Thank you so much for bringing it to us. Tony Dunst, thank you.
Yeah, that sounds great, guys. Looking forward to seeing you both at the win.
Thanks, Tony.